Hello, everyone. Welcome to Women of Color Revolutionizing the Energy System with Their Careers, an event co-hosted by Green 2.0 and Energy Allies. I'm Adrienne Odisea, the Deputy Director at Green 2.0. Our organization works to diversify the environmental movement and ensure that environmental organizations and foundations are inclusive and equitable. We believe that every person should be at the decision-making table in our movement, but that too often the voices of people of color are absent from those conversations, and those conversations impact them the most. During today's event, you'll hear from women of color leading the clean energy transition on what it takes to create a more equitable energy future that makes clean energy accessible to all. Just a quick housekeeping note before we start. If you have questions throughout the event, please put them in the Q&A box. We will try to the best of our ability to get through all of them. We may not be able to. If you do have additional questions afterwards, you can email info@diversescreen.org and we can get them all to the appropriate folks. Before we start, I just want to have a special thanks to Energy Allies. We really appreciate you inviting us to collaborate on this event. This is a really important, amazing work that you lead. So thank you for being such a wonderful partner. And then we also like to thank Director Baker for being a part of this event. Thank you for taking the time and for being part of such an important conversation as well. And of course, I want to thank all of you for joining us today and listening to this great conversation. Before we get started, I have a quick poll to share with you all. And so I think, yeah, you should see it all up here. So today's poll is: how accessible are energy careers to you and your family or your community? They can be very accessible, somewhat accessible, unsure, rarely accessible, or inaccessible. And would love for folks to just select their answers. And we'll give it a few seconds to get through. Folks, a few more minutes, a few more seconds to get in. Wonderful. So it looks like we've got 4% inaccessible. We've got a lot of sort of in the middle, rarely accessible, 24%. We've got a lot of unsure, which is okay, 35%, somewhat accessible at 30%, and very accessible at 7%. We're really, thank you for answering these questions. And throughout the conversation, I think a lot of this is going to be touched upon. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our moderator, Sarah Chandler, to get us started.
Thank you, Adrienne. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Chandler. I'm so excited to be here. I'm the Managing Director of Equity and Access at Elemental Accelerator. And at Elemental, we intentionally invest globally in entrepreneurs and technologies that center communities from traditionally excluded backgrounds. And I'm really excited to welcome you here today. We're here to reflect on what it means to revolutionize the energy system with your career. And I want to bring the description of the panel into the room for a second before we get started and read it aloud, just a small section of it. So for women of color, our voices have the capacity to rebuild infrastructure where we need it the most. Our voices have the power to demand justice, equity, inclusion, belonging, and access for people of color in energy policy and initiatives. We need to center diverse perspectives in the just transition to clean energy. So thank you, Green 2.0 and Energy Allies, for those beautiful words. I think myself, I'll speak for myself, but I know many of us are showing up today with grief from the past week and weekend that we've had: patriarchy, white supremacy. These are continuing evidence that the work we're doing on energy justice is so important and not abstract work. We have to continue to work and think at a systems level on energy justice and redesigning systems, because we know our system is going to continue working in the way that it's designed to. We know that multiple things can happen at the same time. Non-binary thinking is very handy. That devastating murders can be happening, that grief can be happening. And we have strong leadership. We have the nation's first ever Deputy Director for Energy Justice, and that was just her first role. We have strong entrepreneurs. We have our ecosystem. And we've built all this together, and we can be grateful because we know that it comes in sharp relief to how others might be spending their mornings or afternoons today because of the system that we're currently living in. So I just want to express some gratitude and excitement for the leaders in the conversation today. We're in the midst of greatness today, and just bring the work that they've done in very different ways that has contributed so greatly to the energy sector. So I want to create a lot of space in this conversation for our three speakers. Anytime they want to jump in or reflect or comment, I'll ask that they do, and you also in the audience, because this is a very special opportunity. We get to hear from folks who've been doing very different things and bring something different to each question. So with that, I'm going to start with our introductions. So I'd love for Yesenia Rivera, the Executive Director of Energy Allies, to go first. Then we'll go with Steph Spears, from the co-founder CEO at Solstice, and then Shalonda Baker, the Director of Economic Impact at the Department of Energy. And if you could each introduce yourself and then share one piece of advice at the end of your introduction that you'd like to give to young leaders on climate justice or young entrepreneurs of color to start us off.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm Yesenia Rivera. I'm the Executive Director at Energy Allies, and I'm still getting used to saying that. We just rebranded a few weeks ago. You may have known as the Solstice Initiative. And how I ended up in energy justice was definitely not a straight road. I've been a community organizer for the past 10 years. Half of those I spent in energy justice. And, I grew up with energy insecurity, with energy burdens. I grew up in Puerto Rico, living through hurricanes and the effect they had, but I never thought I would end up in energy justice until the foreclosure crisis reared its head. I was a housing counselor, and I saw the effect that it was having that on our community. I was working mostly with Latino and Black families that were going through and paying the price of out of control mortgage rates. And even if we could get them a modification for their mortgages, they were still suffering in terms of their utility bills. They were completely out of control, and there was absolutely nothing that could be done. And I think that sort of, went back to growing up with that energy insecurity, growing up with energy justice issues. Like, there has to be something. Eventually, I found the path to solar energy and how to make it more accessible for all, which is sort of what I do now. It's making sure that we all have access and we all have a say in our clean energy system, especially those that suffer the most from climate and or current climate crisis. If I have one piece of advice, is don't let imposter syndrome stop you. It is very much real. It can be paralyzing, thinking that I don't deserve to be in these spaces, I don't deserve to be in these conversations, but that is furthest from the truth. Our voices are needed now more than ever. If we are going to achieve that just transition and that equity in our energy system, our voices are needed. Frontline communities, the communities that are impacted the most by climate change, need to be part of that conversation, need to be leading that conversation if we're going to achieve anything. So don't let imposter syndrome stop you. It's just power through.
Thank you, Yesenia. I'd like to hand it over to Steph Spears next, co-founder of Solstice. Share your introduction and one piece of advice you have for young climate justice leaders and entrepreneurs of color.
Hey everyone, I'm Steph Spears. Thanks so much for having me. And I manage a company called Solstice. We connect households and businesses to community shared solar farms because 4 out of 5 Americans cannot put solar on their own rooftop. Also, like Yesenia, had a bit of a meandering journey through the energy environmental world. I grew up in Hawaii, so I grew up surrounded by natural beauty, and from an early age recognized that the Hawaiian people were marginalized and disproportionately affected, yet had very little voice in some of the policy that we were seeing as people in Hawaii. And so grew up realizing that the gap between the haves and the have-nots were very, very wide, and wanted to spend my career working in that. First, I started as a political organizer, did organize communities across the country, then worked in the Obama world as an organizer, and then eventually joined the administration in working in Middle East policy. And it was working in the Middle East where I realized that the geopolitics of oil are so broken, and yet we weren't talking about renewable energy in government. So I left government to go learn about renewables. First spent some time in India, then in Pakistan, deploying energy in communities that had no access to the grid, off-grid communities, deploying solar lanterns, solar home systems. And then I had another realization that I didn't need to be halfway across the world to work on energy access issues, because back home in America, so many people lacked access to solar and clean energy. And we believe clean energy is a human right. As a society, we're not quite there yet. And so Solstice has been working to create a clean energy constituency, people who can finally benefit from clean energy, the communities of color and low income folks who need access to solar savings the most and are least likely to get it in this current period of time. So in terms of one piece of advice, working at the highest levels of government, I don't know if this will register with Shalonda, who does work at the highest levels of government now. But when I used to work in government, I looked around and noticed that there was no way that everyone at the highest levels of government knew what they were talking about 100% of the time. And in a lot of ways throughout my career, I have felt supremely unqualified for every position I had. And yet it all worked out. And so to Yesenia's point, never disqualify yourself for any role. There are a ton of white males out there who are applying for roles that they are unqualified for. And there's so much that you can learn on the job. And as long as you approach every role with your values and with your hard work and integrity, you can have incredible careers, even if you have no experience in it. And so just know that everyone else is figuring it out when they're making decisions. And we just need the people in those roles to bring in their value systems and moral leadership into the role more than ever, which is why you all on the call should have those roles in the energy leadership in this country. We are building the plane and we're building the ship as we are sailing it, as someone in the audience said.
Thank you so much, Steph. I'll pass it to you, Dr. Baker, or Director Baker.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And just want to say it is really an honor to be on this panel with Steph and Yesenia, two women I have long admired and counted as co-conspirators and colleagues in this space. And Sarah, it's great to see you as well. It's been a while. It's been a crazy couple years here at the Department of Energy. I could go on, but I want to, I'll be very succinct in answering your questions. So, and look forward to the broader conversation. As you mentioned in the intro, Sarah, I was the country's first ever Deputy Director for Energy Justice, and now I'm the Director of the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity and the Secretary's Advisor on Equity here at DOE. None of this was sort of planned or intentional on my part. I started my journey in energy justice, way back in 2010. I had just left legal practice where I served as a project finance lawyer, helping the largest corporations in the world build projects, energy projects, mainly in the US and a couple outside of the United States. I left that running, really wanting to work with communities. As an energy lawyer, I became aware of the issues that were confronting indigenous communities in Latin America. And those communities were, fighting against coal, oil, and gas development. And so I thought I'm going to go down to Latin America very naively and, be a human rights lawyer or an advocate for those folks. And I found myself in a place called Oaxaca, Mexico, and just really fell in love with it. And when I got there, I actually met Indigenous people who were fighting against clean energy development. And it turns out that the same techniques of development, the same ways in which those communities were divided, were sort of displaced and dispossessed. They were, the same things that they did in the fossil fuel industry were being replicated in clean energy. And in that moment, it really occurred to me that if we did not actively intervene in the clean energy transition, we would see the exacerbation of inequity and replication of that inequity in this clean energy work. So way back in 2010, when it was pretty unpopular to talk about social issues and environmental issues alongside climate, I started talking about these things. And so I had the privilege of coming back to the US and becoming a law professor, teaching in San Francisco, and then got a really amazing opportunity to teach in Hawaii at the flagship university, the law school there, and was an activist, basically. I mean, as a law professor, you get entree into a lot of different rooms in Hawaii. It's a small place, so you can meet with the governor if you have something to say. But I was really interested in meeting with communities. When I was there, I think, like Yesenia, like Steph, I looked around and I saw that Indigenous communities and communities of color were suffering the social and economic and environmental impacts of the energy system. So a lot of the dirtiest generation was located in West Oahu, which is also where the majority BIPOC community. They were also, the cost of energy and electricity in Hawaii is through the roof. And so these are low-income communities that were also paying disproportionately for energy. And they also lacked access to things like solar. So I brought community voices into the energy policy debate in Hawaii, which again, even in 2014, at that point, it was unpopular because many folks saw the energy transition as purely technical, right? How do we get megawatts on the grid? How do we keep the lights on? And I knew that there were systems, and there was a system in which the energy system itself operated. And so, again, very unpopular for a long time in my career. But luckily, these topics became more mainstream. And so I left Hawaii. I started another organization. Well, I did a Fulbright back in Mexico, got to really have a full circle moment as a scholar, mainly working in the Yucatan Peninsula with Indigenous communities and activists on energy transition issues. And then I made it back to Boston, which is where I went to law school, went to my alma mater to be a professor, started another organization called the Initiative for Energy Justice, which was all about connecting frontline leaders and frontline communities to broader energy policy debates in their different states. So it was a national organization as opposed to the local Hawaii-based one that I started at the law school in Hawaii. So as doing that work, folks noticed, I think both movement leaders, state and local leaders, and someone let the Biden administration know that I was doing that work. And they said, well, we need someone to shepherd the just and equitable energy transition in this country. Would you be interested? Like, absolutely. But again, this was not intentional. All along, I was just following my heart and following, my intuition, basically. And, once I saw injustice and inequity in the energy system, I couldn't unsee it. And so I would end my introduction remarks by really just saying, trust your voice. And it kind of connects to the thread that Steph and Yesenia started around believing that you belong and that you have a seat. I mean, I can't even count the number of times that people looked at me like, girl, you don't know what you're talking about. Shut your mouth, basically. First of all, I was playing in the realm of finance. Second of all, I was speaking in majority white environmental spaces about, Indigenous rights, and that was like not really resonating. And even now, at the very top level of government, at the Department of Energy, there are ways in which these concepts are still very hard for some people to hear. But I know that there's a path, and I know that this is the right thing, and I know that I was brought into this world to be the carrier of this, along with so many people who are in this room with me today. So believe that your voice matters. And I will kick it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Shalonda. I'm so inspired already. I'm just so grateful to be able to start my week having this conversation with you all. And I just want to voice a lot of the gratitude that's happening in the chat right now for the inspiration. And what I've heard already is just the feeling of your own voice, holding on to it, knowing that it's important, knowing that it matters. You could have been deflated, but you decided, you saw something, you saw injustice, you saw inequity, and you had to say something. And I think that's a choice, and that's a really inspiring choice and thread that I see throughout our panelists. And it's a continuous practice, which I know we can all relate to. In our next question, I want to share a quote that I came across recently by Toni Morrison. It really makes me think of our speakers. So she was asked, how do you survive whole in a world when we're all victims of something? I'm going to paraphrase what she said, but it was, sometimes you don't survive whole, you just survive in part. But the grandeur of life is about the attempt and not just the solution. It's about being fearless and behaving beautifully across impossible circumstances. Doing good is more interesting, more complex, more demanding. The work of survival, blossoming, endurance are all more compelling intellectually, spiritually, and just a way more fascinating job. And I can share the quote in the chat. It's a video that I'll send. And yeah, you all have used your voices, your experiences, and your compassion for others. So I'm wondering, how does your lived experience impact the way you work in energy now? When did you realize this power in your career, and was there a turning point for you? And then I think we'll start with Steph this time.
So I am the child of immigrants. My mom was an immigrant from Korea, and she ended up being a single mom after a while, raising 3 kids alone on a salary that was effectively minimum wage. And as we all know in this country, it's very, very, very difficult for a family to raise kids, much less survive alone on minimum wage. And so my mom worked a few jobs. And one of her jobs was as a call center representative at airlines. And every day she would get people on the phone and they would yell at her, go back to your own country, can't understand what you're saying. And I would look at my mom, this dignified, incredible woman who would be a much better CEO of a company than I would. And I would see the way the world saw her versus the way I saw her had nothing to do with her talents and her abilities, but everything to do with the opportunities that were given to her and the constraint on her. And so I grew up thinking that the line between the people who had all the power and capital and the people who didn't was completely arbitrary. And I also grew up quite mute. People have a hard time believing this because I so much of my job is to talk about energy access, but I was scared to use my voice growing up. I was just always observing, always watching. And then it wasn't until I graduated from college that I realized that my voice had made a difference. If you go to a typical energy conference, you would rarely, up until recently, see anyone talking about energy justice. And if so, it'd be a very side panel. It wouldn't be on the main stage. And it would be all the folks who care deeply about the topic, but none of the folks that should have been in the room, like the landowners, the capital providers, or the developers of clean energy projects. And so we started talking about our experience, being the community, seeing the people that needed solar savings the most be locked out the most from these projects. And a little known fact, in solar in America, you need a FICO credit score to get access to a lot of solar power because a lot of people can't pay for solar upfront. And the credit cutoff that they have is 680 and above, which half the country doesn't have that credit score and is thus locked out of rooftop solar. And for some inexplicable reason, a lot of community solar projects have FICO score requirements. And this whole time when this was happening, where we would go to communities and try to sign people up and they couldn't sign up because they didn't have the right FICO credit score, I'd hear my mom's voice in the back of my head saying, just because we don't have a good FICO credit score does not make us bad people. That's something she said all of the time we were growing up. And so we said, why do we even rely on FICO credit scores at all? Why don't we just try to find a better way to qualify customers? And so we looked into it and we found that the people who pay their utility bills on time every month never get credit for it in their FICO credit scores. FICO is based on some archaic algorithm that was invented in 1956. And it looks at your mortgage and maybe your credit repayment. It doesn't look at rental repayment. It doesn't look at utility repayment. It doesn't look at cell phone repayments. All these things that renters and people of color do, but not higher income folks. And so we applied to the Department of Energy to get a grant to create something called the Energy Score, which is a new type of credit score. And this is a lesson number one. The Department of Energy initially told us, no, we don't want you to apply for this. We discourage you from applying for this grant. And even though they told us to not apply, we said, all right, we are just going to rewrite our application and make it better. And even though they discouraged us from applying, we're going to still apply for the grant anyway. And crazy surprise to us, a few months later, we found the Department of Energy kind of reversed their initial decision and gave us $800K in funding to create the Energy Score. And all of this stemmed from a lived experience watching my mom get rejected from credit applications her whole life. And credit determines your destiny in America. It determines whether you sometimes get a job or an apartment or a home, a car. But we have better technology today, better data science today to create better scores that are more accurate and more inclusive. And today, our energy score is more inclusive than the FICO scores, and including people in the clean energy revolution. It's more accurate at predicting who pays their utility bills on time. And so that's a small example of using your lived experience and creating a different path that didn't exist otherwise. And there's no way anyone would have, I think, this would never have happened without the partnership of the Department of Energy in the end. And so it's like, go out and find your people who resonate with your values and create a coalition. And Yesenia has worked hard on the Energy Score too. And Shalonda has worked to help craft the concept behind it too. So you're looking at the coalition, and it gets bigger and bigger as long as you are putting your values out there and saying, this is right. Does anyone want to help me? Can we all do this together?
Thank you so much, Steph. Shout out to the moms. She thought she was just boosting her kids' self-esteem, and look at what she did. Thank you for that story, Steph. Shalonda, did you want to jump in?
Sure, I can jump in with the question, and I'm just so moved by Steph's backstory on that. I actually have known you for years and hadn't heard that story, so it really resonates. I'm another product of a single parent household, single mom who also suffered from extraordinary energy insecurity and energy burden in Austin, Texas. And my mom was a government worker. So, there are many people who are totally plugged into the government system and still are, not able to access benefits or, really keep their household afloat. So there's so many workers, so many people in this country that are having the same experiences I think that each one of us has talked about. So my family obviously has been such an impact on me in terms of how I see the world and how I think about issues of justice. I mentioned my mom, who was a single mom who every day, said, I just can't wait to see what you become. And, she is so proud of me in this role. And, she has like all the clippings and everything of everything I've ever done. She's like, I could write a book. I'm like, Mom, calm down. Moms are so proud. And, my dad grew up in an environmental justice community in Port Arthur, Texas, which is well known to many people in this country who work in environmental justice. I think it has been named one of the most sort of emblematic EJ communities in this country because it's home to the bulk of fossil fuel infrastructure. It's the terminus for a Keystone pipeline. I mean, it's just, it's a majority Latinx, Black community, low income community. My family worked in energy. My grandfather worked, one of those refineries. My uncle worked at a refinery, got injured on the job. My dad he worked for Entergy, which is the utility there. And he also grew up in the housing projects right in town, in a fence line community. And that fence divided Black and brown people from one of the largest oil refineries in the world. And they were, often asked to shelter in place, to go inside because of the illegal emissions that were happening and the toxic emissions that were happening in that community. So my dad died in his early 50s. Before I really became conscious myself, I was in my 30s. Before I knew who I was, before I knew that this was going to be my work, my life's journey. I was still a lawyer at that time, practicing law. But he obviously has been such an influence and whispering to me in this work, because I'm fighting for communities like Port Arthur that are all over the country and honestly all over the world. But that's where I come from. Those are my roots. They are foundational. And I think like so many people of color in this country, I have a story. Everyone has a story, but these are typical stories, honestly. I would say my very personal way in which my lived experience has impacted the work I do today is as a queer woman of color, moving in different spaces. And I was a military officer. Some people know that about me. Went to the Air Force Academy, graduated, and came out under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. And that was way back in early 2000, so 23 years ago, which is hard to believe. I know I don't look it, but yeah, I was a wee babe, and had just gotten out of the military or gotten out of college, became a commissioned officer, and was queer. And this was at a time when you could not be openly LGBTQ in the military. And in fact, you were asked to hide who you were. Unfortunately, I became involved in an abusive relationship at the time, and my partner knew that I couldn't be out. She knew that I couldn't seek help. And so I was essentially every day lying to myself and lying to my boss and the country about who I was, and kind of in this harrowing situation personally. So I did come out. I left the military and sort of committed myself to social justice, committed myself to a life of integrity and always living my values. And so that singular experience as a young 23, 24-year-old has shaped how I move in every single space and has given me the courage to speak up anytime I'm seeing something that isn't right. And so all those years of being in the energy space and the climate space and talking about justice when everyone thought I was crazy, I knew that there was an end to that. And basically my lived experience gave me the courage and power to stay the course for so long. So that's me, and I can pass it on to Yesenia, since I think I want to hear what you have to say too.
Thank you, Shalonda. I don't know, I'm supposed to follow you and Steph on that one, but I will try my best. I mentioned in my introduction, I grew up with energy insecurities. I grew up with energy burdens. I grew up in Puerto Rico. And I remember the first time we were hit by a hurricane after we had moved to the island, and going sometimes weeks without power every hurricane season, which always happen around my birthday. My birthday's at the end of September, and if you've ever lived on the islands, you know that tends to be the time that the hurricanes hit the hardest. It's towards that end of September, and always either having no power, having to do my homework by candlelight, and it just felt normal until I went to high school. I was at a private high school on a scholarship, and realized that not having water, not having power for weeks at a time wasn't really the norm. There was something that was happening in my community because I grew up, and I grew up around family. It was at the end of a dead end street. It had been in my family for generations, the land, but it was a very poor neighborhood. We grew up, on and off of food stamps. My parents will struggle. Neither one of them had a chance to go to college, but they made it a point to my sisters and I that that was the way out. If we wanted to leave that dead end street, if we wanted to be more than that, that we had to focus on our studies, and made that a priority for my sisters and I, which we're terribly grateful. I have my baby sister's a CPA, and my second sister has a PhD in biochem, which is how I ended up going to law school because I couldn't let them beat me with their credentials. So I ended up going for a JD. But growing up in Puerto Rico, seeing what that energy system and how it didn't impact everybody the same way left a mark on me. And when I started working as a housing counselor at the height of the foreclosure crisis, seeing how folks were struggling not just to keep their house, but to keep the lights on, keep the water running. And there was inequality, because it was mostly, like I said, it was mostly Black and brown folks that were paying the price for a deregulated system. And I said, something has to change. There has to be an option. I had the opportunity to move over to energy, to work in solar and help low income families access solar. And as I'm getting ready to do that transition, Hurricane Maria hits Puerto Rico. And it was, about 2 weeks before I started working in solar. And it was some of the worst weeks of my life because it was Harvey, Irma, and Maria back to back. And I have my youngest sister living in Sugarland, which is right outside Houston. My aunt and my grandmother were in Florida and right in the path of Hurricane Irma. And my parents were still in Puerto Rico, still are in Puerto Rico. And, we were okay with Harvey. Irma didn't hit. And then Maria happened. And I didn't hear from my parents for days. And I was one of the lucky ones. I was able to get in touch with them 2 days after the hurricane. They were still relatives that we didn't hear back for months. And my parents had no power for about 4 straight months. They were living with a power generator for months at a time, which didn't help with my mother's asthma. It didn't help with anything that was going on. And knowing that, okay, this is not normal. This is not right. We have an energy system that has failed us, that has broken down. And it gave me that drive, even though, like I said, I was already about to start working with solar and making sure that low to moderate income families had access to solar energy. I realized that solar by itself wasn't going to be enough. And this energy system made the difference between life and death. We lost over 4,000 lives because of Hurricane Maria that we didn't have to, because folks didn't have access to water, didn't have access to electricity. It was a matter of life and death. So I have spent the last 5 years advocating for change in Puerto Rico, as well as solar in general. And while I was at Solar United Neighbors, that was one of the first things, like, what are we going to do? Something needs to change in Puerto Rico. We need to bring solar and storage to folks. We need to make it accessible. And before I left, we managed to establish a program at Solar United Neighbors to help the folks in Puerto Rico have access to solar and storage, to increase access to low and moderate income families. So I'm proud to have been part of that team and part of that conversation. And it's because I knew what it felt like, and every time I'm in a room advocating for more policies that open up solar and storage to folks, I always remember what it felt like to be that kid doing your homework by candlelight, to be that kid watching the TV and not knowing whether or not your parents are okay and when their power is coming back and what that feels like. So when there's a compromise on the line, that's always at the back of my head. It's like you don't know what it feels like to be the person, to be in those shoes, and try to bring that experience to the room and not be afraid to speak up.
Thank you so much, Yesenia. I am so grateful for this conversation and to learn more about your experiences, and just so grateful that you all were brave enough to bring your lived experience into your work and to say this is not normal. Thank you for sharing. I want to talk a little bit more now about resources and the valuable, networks and people, mentors, resources that we have each relied on to get where we're at, knowing that we've navigated and you all have navigated so much. At Elemental, we have an internship program where we rely on small group conversations and networking for the sole reason of the power of relationship building and knowing that you can build together, especially with folks who are doing the same and wanting the same outcomes. And we really rely on that and edict. So I'm wondering, what were some of the resources that you all want to share with folks in the space that helped you, that you found valuable? And Steph, can I start with you this time?
Looks like she froze it just as you were asking her.
Okay. Tawanda, will you be so gracious to start us off then? While she comes.
Oh,
There's a storm going
absolutely.
on and I'm losing power, sorry.
Oh, no problem, Steph. Well, why don't we go while you have power, because you do have a signal now.
Okay, great, thanks.
Let you go.
Sorry, thanks for your patience.
No worries, Steph. Did she break up for anyone else? Yeah, okay.
She did. Maybe I can jump in and we'll kick it over to her after. I do want to just honor the sacred space that
Everyone,
you've created, Sarah. We just laughed her all together. But just honor the sacred space that you've created for us to share our stories. I think most of us are in non-diverse environments, which means we're often the only woman, the only female identified person, only person of color in the room. And I do think it's so important to have safe spaces to share who we are and what informs our work. I also think it's important to continue to share these stories in mixed company as well. And as I always want to underscore, these are common stories and narratives that are just pervasive in our country, but it is important to show the face of it as well. So in my experience, mentors have come from unlikely places. So white men have actually opened doors for me in unexpected ways. Other women of color have also shown the way and, taken a chance on me by bringing me into their work, bringing me into opportunities, letting me fly. I think for women who are more senior, I think it's important for us to always reach back and realize the extraordinary power we have and do the same, right? Take chances, quote unquote, on folks who normally wouldn't be in the room. So I can say, I started at DOE with 37 folks in my shop, and my organization has been around since the 1970s. It's never gotten funded at the level that it needed to until now. We're fighting for more and more funding. We have a bigger footprint. I built the team to almost 100 people. 90% of the team is people of color, and with more PhDs and JDs and MSs and MAs than you can count, right? Like folks who have those traditional markers and who want to do justice work, but who may not have been seen by other folks. I also would say a third of the people are former students, former colleagues of mine that I've recruited over to be a part of this transformative moment. So two things. One, I have found mentors in unlikely spaces. To now that I am where I am, I am showing the department what it looks like to build a team that looks like America, that is a badass, high-powered team that takes no prisoners. So I'm very excited to be in a role that allows me to do that. And then I would say three for those of us who are at the middle, and kind of still building our career at the beginning. I can't overstate the importance of peer-to-peer mentorship. I don't think I had enough of that, but I have more of it now. But when I say peer-to-peer, it's really about building the beloved community and, having those sisters, brothers, whoever, people you can call any time of the day and just be like, let me tell you what happened. This is crazy. Like, just to kind of witness and reflect back that, like, you're not insane. Now go back and, finish the thing. But we have to lift each other up, and we have to sort of get out of this white supremacist patriarchal frame that, like, it's zero sum, we're crabs in a barrel. Like, there's the room, there is more than enough room. There's so much work to do, and all of us have superpowers. So, like, we need to be living our superpower and also relying on each other to support each other, and we all can move forward together. So those are my 3 points. And Steph, we got you back. So Sarah, I'll turn it back over to you though. Moderate.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. Steph, are you with us? Can you chime in here?
Sorry about that. Ironically, had a power outage here in Hawaii.
All connected.
So yes, and this goes back to the resource question, right? So
yes. So Shalonda spoke to kind of resources for folks entering their career. She even said something about mid-career folks. So maybe if you could touch on those with transferable skills or folks who are looking to enter the sector, any advice or resources you would recommend?
Yeah, I can speak from the entrepreneurship perspective too, just trying to start a new organization. And entrepreneurs often talk about their friends and family around, but if you're coming from an under-resourced population, it's more like your acquaintances around. And, we often kind of can get into a mindset where financial capital is the be all and end all. And just want to remind people that there are other types of capital out there. There is human capital and there is social capital. And in my experience, human capital and social capital are far more important than financial capital. In that people will overemphasize financial capital, but it's really the networks and the relationships that we're building that allow us to build that coalition of like-minded folks. So if you're starting a nonprofit or starting a for-profit, which we have experience in doing both, the thing that made it happen for us was really just talking ad nauseum to anyone who would listen and getting them to become advisors to our organization and having them lend us their network to continue our networking to people who had financial capital but it originally started with social capital. So I find that social capital is the most important capital, and you can build that even if you come from someone with no money, a family with no money. You can build that just by looking around at your classmates and talking to them and connecting with their families, or connecting to classmates just to get their advice. And then eventually we got connected to more people in energy. And thankfully, with programs like Edict and like Elemental, there are now fellowships that allow people from under-resourced backgrounds get access to these networks that they didn't grow up with. That's how we did it. Echoing Green was huge for us. That's a grant given to social entrepreneurs. Acumen does a fellowship for people all over the world from marginalized backgrounds. I did that fellowship, and that's what led us to eventually raise money from the Acumen founder, Jacqueline Novogratz, who's an incredible person in social enterprise. And so applying for every fellowship under the sun, applying for these programs that are geared towards people who don't grow up with money, was how we eventually got financial capital, because it started with a human and social capital. So I'll pass it on to Yesenia from there.
Steph. I would say, though I think Shalonda and Steph have made some really good points, but that networking, that sounding board, I think it's what's been really important, especially now in my role as an ED. I'm a first-time ED. I'm a woman of color. Last thing I want to do is mess this up, even though I have a fantastic board, including Steph and Sarah on that board. But it's been very helpful to have other friends that are also in the same shoes. And whenever something happens, like they're a phone call away, they're a message away. It's like somebody to just, it's like, how do I do this? It's like, what are you doing when you see this? And just keep going, knowing that you're not alone. I think. And also in terms of resources, the one that's helped me, and though I did help write this, was the People's Utility Justice Playbook. Hearing other stories from what's happening across the country, and knowing you're not alone and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So those kind of resources do help move the work forward. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to cut it there. Hand it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Yesenia. And I would be remiss if I didn't plug Elemental Internship Program, Empowering Diversity and Climate Talent that Steph mentioned. It opens on February 1st. So if folks are interested, those roles will be open. I want to ask one more question, and then I'll ask one of our audience questions as well before we close. If you could each share how you're working to center communities in the energy system. What is your role in amplifying community voices, and how can other organizations do so? And Yesenia, I would love for you to answer this one to start.
Yeah, so Energy Allies centers climate impacted communities. We do this with clean energy projects, advocacy, and education. So we work with communities, especially communities that have been excluded from the clean energy conversation, and make sure they are the ones leading the conversation. When we talk about community solar, we're not just talking about, building and megawatts and all these projects and just focusing on the projects. We focus on what does the community need, what do they want, and follow their lead. And I think that's very important moving forward because, like I said, we've been excluded from these conversations. You've heard it throughout the topic today. And if we're really going to achieve that just transition, if we're going to not just swap out clean energy, renewable energy for fossil fuels and leave an extractive energy system, we truly need to have communities of color, frontline communities, under-resourced communities, being the one to take the lead. Because if they can work on a system that works for them, it will work for everyone. And that is what we need. We need to not just build projects for the sake of building projects, not just have clean energy for the sake of having clean energy. We have an opportunity to truly build a new system, and we have to take that. And that means centering communities of color, centering climate impacted communities to take the lead and learn from them and their experience and build a system that works for everyone.
Thank you, Yesenia. I want to try to make time for one of the questions in the chat too, which I think is a pretty powerful one. And Yesenia, you just spoke to that so beautifully. So I think if others want to chime in, please do. But I think we could also add into the conversation, what advice do you have for leading with your values in a sector where they can often be challenged? And I think it's important to add this one into the conversation with centering communities, because so much of your work is, as Shalonda mentioned earlier, committing to working with your integrity. So I'm wondering if you all could share one piece of advice there before we close out. And then I'll start with Steph.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of what Solstice does when we try to increase access to community solar projects across the country is convince developers and financiers that is in their interest. And this conversation and this question gets real tactical. How do you, with your best values and your perspective coming from a marginalized community, how do you get the people with power and capital who are already building gigawatts of clean energy projects to even pay attention to this? And it comes down to something that we have to do every single day. We call it code switching. I call it, in this context, cultural translation. We have to convince these people that it is in their interest to increase access to low-income communities. And so we've learned to translate in a way that gets them interested, even if it achieves the same outcome, which is, let's get more low-income people in these projects. It used to be that I would go to developers and say, let's get low-income people as part of these projects. And they would say, no, it's too risky. The risks are too high because we're going to lose money because low-income people move and they don't pay their bills and they're going to default more often. And so we would say, actually, your perception of risk is not accurate. And I have a new data algorithm called the energy score that proves that your perception of risk is wrong. And we can still make the project economics work while still mitigating risk. The other thing we can talk about is let's talk about the long-term viability of your projects. Your long-term viability of your project is going to increase and your revenue is going to increase if we have customers that are paying their bills on time. It doesn't matter if they're low income or high income. And so you have to actually speak in their language to get them to buy in. And that's just the first step, because once you get them to buy in and they see that they're wrong with their data, then it changes the outcomes. Then they're like, oh, I trust you. Why don't you take care of all my customers and you choose who gets to be in projects, you take the risk. And then it doesn't matter to me who's participating in the projects. So Solstice as an organization takes on the risk, and we go out into low-income communities. We partner with organizations that serve people with disabilities. We partner with employers of low-income households, and we're working with them to sign low-income households up for community solar projects. And we put our balance sheet on the line to mitigate the risk for the people who with money who only care about revenue. And so you got to get real tactical, because we live in the world that we do in order to make this happen. And then we tap different kinds of funding to mitigate the risk. But it goes to show that in the long run, you can prove that low-income customers should be accessing these projects, and that everyone's perception and myths about low-income customers are wrong. And it takes time, but that comes from building power within communities, and then proving the people who have money wrong in their assumptions.
Yeah, I'll jump in because I know we're going to run out of time here. So plus one to what Yesenia and Steph have shared in terms of tactics. I think we cannot overstate the importance of data. So leading with integrity in my work, it's so important for me to say 1 in 3 Americans lives with energy insecurity. 52.2% of those people are Black. 47% of Latinx communities live with energy insecurity, and 52.2% of Black households live with energy insecurity. Like, throw the data out, right? I mean, that allows you to sort of challenge folks to actually go against, what the data really speaks. I also just want to challenge all of us here and the 149 people in the room to never lose sight of the broader project, which is dismantling structural racism and structural inequality. So while we are strategic in the moment, recognizing the limitations of today's game, I'm hopeful that the next generation is playing in a different game with different roles. And I will break my neck, to make sure that is true. So I swallow and, take this system and recognize that I'm working toward dismantling it.
That is a wonderful way to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Shalonda, for those words, and to this very inspiring and amazing panel. I just want to echo that there has been just a resurgence, influx of new capital into our sector. And with that, it's bringing new ways of deploying this money and new leadership. And with that new power, new influence, there are new careers. So this is a time for everyone on this phone call, on this Zoom, wherever you are, to join into this conversation, into this work if you're not already. We need everyone with all kinds of skills to take on these opportunities. So just want to, again, thank you all for being here. Thank you to Energy Allies, Green 2.0, to our wonderful, inspiring speakers, Shalonda, Steph, and Yesenia. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your week. I'm also going to put in the chat the quote from before. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.